some nights feel too quiet, like the whole world is holding its breath. The night of September 4th, 1971 in Valenton, Virginia was exactly that kind of night. The wedding party had filled St. Dominic's Parish Hall all evening, a simple cream-painted building with creaky floorboards and a wobbling ceiling fan. Roses in mason jars lined windowsills. Paper lanterns swayed gently from the ceiling, casting a soft golden light over 83 guests. Everyone had eaten, danced, and raised glasses of sweet tea and a few secret flasks to celebrate Eleanor Marsh and Daniel Calloway. Eleanor was 24, with dark honey-colored hair. She had a quiet habit of pressing 3 fingers to her cheek when unsure. In photos, she looks calm, beautiful. In a dress she altered. She stands beside Daniel, his hand on her back, her face showing happiness. But in one blurry, candid shot, Eleanor stands alone near the back door looking outside. Her face is open, unarranged. She had no time to hide her true feelings. Nobody studied that photograph for many years. It sat in a shoebox. By the time anyone looked, decades had passed and Eleanor Marsh was gone. The last confirmed thing: Eleanor and Daniel left the hall just before midnight. By 11, guests were gone. Lanterns stopped swaying. Roses began to wilt. Herschel Pruitt, owner of Hargrove Inn, had given them the corner room as a wedding gift, leaving champagne with a note. Daniel signed the guest register at 11:54 p.m. The owner watched them walk upstairs, locked the front door, and went to bed. Then came the moment that changed everything. Daniel Calloway came downstairs alone at 6:17 the next morning. He told Herschel his wife was not in the room, not in the building, not anywhere. Herschel's first thought was a mix-up. His second thought, arriving with much more weight, was that there had not been. The room held details that answered nothing. Eleanor Calloway was gone. The window was latched from the inside. The door had been locked. There was no sign of any struggle. The champagne had been opened, 2 glasses poured. Her wedding dress was folded neatly over a chair, her shoes placed beneath it, her purse on the dresser. Her cardigan hung behind the door. The bed had been slept in, or at least laid in, on one side only. Daniel said he had fallen asleep around 2 in the morning. He said when he woke up, she was gone. He said he had heard nothing in the night. He said his wife was happy. He said he did not understand. This town had its own rules, not written down anywhere. Valenton was built on tobacco money and old family names. Reputation was everything there. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and causing a public scene without solid proof was the hardest thing. Eleanor was the second daughter of Robert Marsh, who ran the hardware store and was known as a quiet, decent man. Her mother, Margaret Marsh, was a more complicated person. Depending on who you asked, she was either sharp or cold, clever or calculating. Most people agreed. Margaret had grown up with very little, married a man not quite successful enough, and worked hard to seem like she belonged to a higher society. Eleanor had watched her mother perform this act her whole life. She learned the difference between what a person feels and what they say in Valenton. She had a talent, and she almost used it. At 19, Eleanor wanted to study art at a state university 2 hours away. Her high school teacher told her father that Eleanor's drawings were something worth cultivating. But Margaret listened politely, then explained the family couldn't afford it. Besides, she said, a girl with Eleanor's looks had other possibilities, ones that did not require her to be 2 hours away among strangers. Eleanor did not argue. She put away her sketchbooks. She took a bookkeeping job at the pharmacy on Clement Street, and she worked there for 5 years. Then a stranger arrived, and Margaret noticed immediately. Daniel Calloway came to Valenton to manage the new regional bank office. He was 31 years old. He wore pressed shirts even on hot days. He was handsome in a careful, controlled way, the way of a man who knew exactly how he looked and kept it up as a professional tool. He came from a family in Roanoke with a respected name and modest money, exactly the combination Margaret Marsh had been quietly watching for, with the patience of a woman who had decided that patience was her only real option. When Daniel started coming into the pharmacy and speaking to Eleanor with close attention that had little to do with any prescription, Margaret took careful note. When he asked Robert Marsh's permission to call on Eleanor 3 months later, Margaret did not wait for Eleanor to form her own opinion. before she started forming it for her. The courtship lasted 14 months. From the outside, it looked successful. Daniel was considerate. He brought flowers to dinner. He was respectful to Margaret, friendly with Robert, and spoke to Eleanor as though he genuinely found her interesting. But Eleanor's closest friend, a woman named Ruth Ann Poole, who worked beside her at the pharmacy, noticed things. Small things, important things. Before Daniel, Eleanor had been a person of small but steady acts of independence. She kept a notebook full of drawings, thoughts, and clippings from magazines. She read late into the night. She had opinions and she shared them, sometimes disagreeing without apologizing. During the 14 months of courtship, the notebook disappeared. The late-night reading became early sleep. Her opinions came less often, and when they did come, they arrived wrapped in apologies that had not been there before. Ruth Ann noticed all of this and said nothing, because these kinds of changes seemed like normal adjustments a woman made when preparing for marriage. Ruth Ann herself was making similar adjustments and assumed it was just what getting ready for marriage looked like. Some things are said lightly because they are too heavy to say seriously. One afternoon, 3 weeks before the wedding, Eleanor said something to Ruth Ann that Ruth Ann would carry with her for the rest of her life. They were pricing items in the back of the pharmacy, and Eleanor said, without looking up from the shelf, that she sometimes thought about what it would be like to simply leave. Not dramatically, she said. Not in a rush. Just to go somewhere, be nobody for a while, and find out what she actually thought about things when she was only thinking for herself. She said it lightly, the way people say things they need to say out loud without wanting anyone to take seriously. Ruth Ann laughed a little and said something about how they would both be somebody's wife soon enough, and that was its own kind of freedom. Eleanor agreed with the laugh, if not quite with the words. She went back to the shelf. 3 weeks later, she married Daniel Calloway at St. Dominic's Parish Hall while paper lanterns swayed overhead, and her mother watched from the third row with an expression of satisfaction so complete it barely left room for joy. Small town reacts differently than a big city, and Vallotton reacted completely. The search that began on the morning of September 5, 1971, had the confused energy of a community with no map for what was happening. Sheriff's officers walked the grounds of the Hargrove Inn and the surrounding streets. Volunteers searched the riverbank and the fields at the edge of town. Margaret Marsh sat in her kitchen and received neighbors with a stillness so complete it was hard to read. Grief or something else, or both. Robert Marsh drove slowly through every road in and out of town, as if Eleanor might simply be walking somewhere, as if this might still turn out to have a simple explanation. Daniel Calloway was questioned twice on the first day, and 3 more times over the following days. He answered every question with a steady, cooperative calm. Some of the officers found this reassuring. Others found it hard to name. He seemed, by all appearances, like a man who had lost something and could not yet fully accept that it was gone. His family drove up from Roanoke. The two families sat together in the particular closeness of people joined by difficulty, rather than by the joy they had expected. Every lead went nowhere. There was no sign of a forced entry or exit, no ransom note, no witness who had seen Eleanor leave the inn or seen anyone enter it. The locked window and the locked door gave up nothing useful. The county medical examiner had nothing to examine. The state police sent a detective who spent 3 days in Vallotton, developed a theory, and then kept that theory to himself because he had no facts to support it yet. The theory, in its simplest form, was this. Eleanor Calloway had left on purpose. She had quietly unlocked the door, walked down the stairs without waking the owner, and simply walked away from her marriage on the very night it began. But a theory needs something solid to stand on, and what this theory needed was a reason, and a reason required knowledge of Eleanor's private life that no one seemed to have, or that no one seemed willing to share. The official notes from the investigation state: no evidence of forced entry or exit. No evidence of a struggle. Personal belongings, including purse, identification, and financial documents, remained in the room. Husband Daniel Thomas Calloway was interviewed on September 5th, 7, 9, and 14. His answers were the same in each interview. No charges were filed. Moving on is not the same as forgetting, and Vallotton learned the difference. The searches continued for 2 weeks, then they became occasional. Then they stopped being organized and became instead the private, irregular efforts of people who had never made peace with having no answer. Ruth Ann Poole drove the county roads alone on Sunday afternoons for months. Robert Marsh wrote letters to state agencies that came back with polite, formal replies and no real help. The case stayed open in the way that no file is ever truly closed. It simply moved to a shelf, then to a room, then to a storage building in the county seat, where it waited alongside other unsolved things, patient as everything kept in the dark tends to be. By 1973, Valentin had largely adjusted to the disappearance the way a body adjusts to an old injury. Not healed exactly, but absorbed. Daniel Calloway remained in town for 2 years after the wedding night, working at the bank, living in an apartment he had moved into when it became clear he could not stay at the Hargrove Inn. He was polite to people and people were polite back. He attended church. He kept his shirts pressed. Nobody said publicly what some of them were privately thinking, because in a town like Valentin, making a public accusation without public proof was a mistake with consequences. And the people who might have spoken were also the people who had to keep living there. In 1973, Daniel Calloway accepted a transfer to the bank's main office in Richmond. He packed his apartment into a rented truck, shook hands with the men who came to see him off, accepted a brief and careful goodbye from Margaret Marsh, and drove out of Valentin on a Tuesday morning in April with the windows down. He showed, as far as anyone could tell, no visible weight beyond the ordinary weight of a man who has been through something difficult and is ready to move on to something new. The years went by. The town changed slowly, the way small towns do. The pharmacy closing, the hardware store selling, the children growing up and mostly leaving. 38 years later, a cardboard box cracked the whole mystery open. It was 2009 when the story moved again. A woman named Diane Pruitt, daughter of Herschel Pruitt, the former owner of the Hargrove Inn, who had passed away in 2001, was clearing the last of her father's belongings from a storage unit in Charlottesville. Her father had been a careful keeper of things. There were boxes from every decade of his adult life, labeled in his neat handwriting. Diane worked through them in order with the determined speed of a woman who had been putting off this task for 8 years and was finally going to finish it before her daughter's school year ended, in a box labeled Hargrove Miscellaneous 1965-1975, beneath a stack of maintenance records, a broken watch band, and a small brass key with no matching lock. She found an envelope. It was unsealed, cream-colored, softened at the edges from decades in storage. On the front, in handwriting she did not recognize, were 3 words: "For whoever finds." Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. The writing was careful and unhurried, someone who had taken their time. It began, "I don't know who will read this or when. I am writing it because I need there to be something written down somewhere, even if no one ever sees it. My name is Eleanor Marsh. Tonight is my wedding night. I am not happy, and I have not been happy for some time, and I have not said this to anyone because there is no one it would help to say it to. Diane." Pruitt sat on a folding chair in that storage unit for a long time, in the letter in both hands. Then she read it a second time. Then she called her mother. Her mother told her to call the sheriff's office in Valentin. She did. A deputy named Calvin Hess, who had been on the force for only 4 years and had never worked a case older than himself, pulled the physical file on case number 710093 from the county archive. He read it in one sitting at his desk while the office was quiet, and the November light came through the windows at a low, late-afternoon angle. The letter was 4 pages long. It was not a confession. It was not a goodbye. It was not a complete explanation. It was the private account of a woman who was afraid of something she could not yet fully name, written in the small hours of the night she disappeared, at a small writing desk by the window of the corner room, while her husband slept. She wrote that she had moved to the desk because she could not sleep. She had been trying for several months to figure out whether what she felt was unhappiness or just fear. And she had concluded, sitting at that desk, in that room on that night, that it was both, and that the two had become impossible to separate. She wrote about Daniel's behavior. Not the kind that left visible marks, but the kind that arrived as silence, as withdrawal, as the careful withholding of approval in ways designed to make her doubt her own judgment. She wrote that she had told no one about this because she was not sure anyone would recognize it, as a real problem. Nothing had technically happened. There were no obvious incidents she could point to. There was only the slow feeling of being made smaller by a person who she believed had chosen her partly because she was the kind of person who could be made smaller. I want to say clearly that I have not been harmed in any visible way. I want to say that because I know that is the question. The harm is harder to explain. It is in the way I have stopped being sure of things I used to be sure of. I am afraid that if I stay, I will continue in this direction until there is not enough of me left to find my way back. Eleanor Marsh. Letter written September 5, 1971, approximately 2 a.m. Then, on the third page, she wrote a name that no one had ever mentioned before, Thomas Creel. Deputy Hess read it twice, then went back to the first page of the original case file to see if that name appeared anywhere in the original investigation. It did not. In 38 years of open case status, the name Thomas Creel had never appeared in any document connected to Eleanor Calloway's disappearance. Not once. Eleanor's letter described Creel carefully, with a kind of caution, as if she was writing with one eye on the possibility that someone unsympathetic might one day read it. He was not a romantic interest, or not primarily. He was a man she had known since childhood, the son of a farmer who had worked land next to her uncle's property. He had left Valaton at 20 and returned briefly in the spring of 1971, 6 months before the wedding. He had come into the pharmacy twice. In the second visit, he said something she quoted almost word for word in her letter. "You don't look like someone who wants to be where they are." She had told him she was engaged. He said he knew. He said nothing more about it. But what he had given her was a way of seeing herself that she had not had before. Not a romantic possibility, she was careful to say, but a mirror that showed her something she had been avoiding looking at. After he left Valaton again that spring, she had spent the months that followed in growing inner conflict, managing it alone, telling no one, continuing the engagement, continuing the act of a woman who was happily building a future. The letter did not say Thomas Creel had anything to do with her disappearance. It did not say they had made any plans together. What it said on its final page was this: "I have decided that I am going to leave. Not for anyone, not toward anything specific. I am going to put this letter somewhere in this room and I am going to go. I don't know where I'm going exactly. I know that I have a small amount of money I have kept in a separate place for 3 months against the possibility that I might one day feel certain enough to do this. I feel certain enough. I am sorry for the confusion this will cause. I am not sorry for leaving." She signed it with her given name, Eleanor Marsh, not Calloway. Marsh Deputy Hess had been handed a thread, and he pulled it. He was 27 years old and had grown up in Valaton, and had heard the story of Eleanor Calloway's disappearance the way all children in the town heard it, as a cautionary tale, a mystery, or both, depending on who was telling it. He understood, reading the letter, that what he held in his hands was not a solution to a mystery, but the beginning of a very different kind of investigation. One that was no longer about what had happened to Eleanor, but about what Eleanor had chosen and who had known, and who had stayed quiet. He started with what he had: a name. Thomas Creel. A record search returned 3 men with that name in Virginia. One of them, Thomas Allen Creel, born 1944 in Vailton County, was living in Waynesboro, retired from a career as a structural engineer, and reachable by phone. Hess drove to Waynesboro on a Thursday morning in December 2009. He found Thomas Creel at the address listed, a small house with a garden that had been put to bed for winter, the dried stalks of sunflowers still standing along the fence. Creel was 65 years old, gray-haired. When he opened the door and Hess introduced himself and said he was working on a cold case involving a woman named Eleanor Marsh, Creel stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, Arwen, as though he had been waiting for exactly this moment, and said, "I wondered when someone would come." What Creel told Hess over 4 hours at his kitchen table was the most complete picture of Eleanor Marsh's inner life that anyone would ever put together. It was both more and less than Hess had hoped for. More because Creel had spoken to Eleanor in ways her letter had not fully captured. Less because it was still not the whole story, and Creel was careful to say so, more than once, with the care of a man who had lived for decades knowing he held something important. who had made a decision about it and who was not fully at peace with that decision. He had known Eleanor from a distance growing up. Different schools, different social circles, but the same county and the kind of easy familiarity that comes from sharing a small place. When he came back to Valton in the spring of 1971, he had not gone looking for her. He had run into her in the pharmacy by the kind of chance that happens in small towns. They had spoken twice. What he noticed, he told Hess, was a quality of suppression in her, a woman managing herself very carefully, choosing her words rather than speaking them, presenting a version of herself that seemed to require real effort. He had made the remark she quoted in her letter, "You don't look like someone who wants to be where they are," because it was true, and because he came from a family that had never learned to leave true things unsaid, even when saying nothing would have been the easier, kinder-seeming choice. After he left Valton that spring, he had not heard from Eleanor. He did not expect to. He thought about her sometimes, the way you think about someone whose situation troubles you when you are honest with yourself in the quiet hours of a night you cannot sleep through. He had seen the notice of the wedding in the county paper in August. He had not contacted her. Then on September 6, 1971, the morning after the wedding, the same day the disappearance was reported, something remarkable happened. He had received a phone call from Eleanor. She was at a payphone in Harrisonburg, 60 miles north of Valton. She was calm, he said, composed. She told him she had left and was going further north. She was not asking for anything except for him to know, because there was no one else she could think of who would understand why, without needing more explanation than she had the energy to give. He had asked if she was safe. She said yes. He asked if there was anything he could do. She said no. He asked if she was going to be all right. There was a pause. Then she said, "I think I'm going to find out." He never heard from her again. He had kept a secret for 38 years, and he had reasons. He had not told anyone about the call. Not in 1971, not in any of the decades that followed. He had made that decision in the hours after she hung up, and he had made it because Eleanor had not asked him to keep the call private, but had also not asked him to do anything with it. Telling anyone felt like betraying the only act of trust she had extended to anyone in what seemed like a very long time. He understood that by staying quiet, he had allowed her family, her husband, and the whole town to believe in a mystery that was not, in fact, mysterious. He said he had lived with that, and that living with it had not been simple, and that he was glad someone had finally come to ask. She was not missing. That is the thing I want to be clear about. She was not taken. She was not lost. She knew exactly where she was, and she had chosen it. I thought that was something she had the right to. I still think so. I also think I may have been wrong. Thomas Creel, interview with Deputy Calvin Hess, December 2009. Now, Hess had one answer, but it led to a deeper question. He had a woman who had left on purpose and a man who had known it and said nothing. That explained the disappearance. But it did not explain everything, because Eleanor's letter, read carefully, described a marriage that had not yet technically begun and was already operating like a system of quiet control. And quiet, deliberate control is not just the private sadness of a woman who married the wrong person. It is something that can be looked at more closely. Hess located Daniel Calloway through bank pension records. He was 69 years old, retired, living in a neighborhood outside Richmond with a wife of 20 years named Patricia and 2 adult children whose photos were on his public profile online. Hess looked at those photos on his phone in the parking lot of a rest stop on the highway. A man who appeared, by all the visible evidence of his public life, to have had a full and ordinary life after Valentin Hess contacted the Richmond Police Department and made a formal request. A detective named Amara Osi joined him when he drove to Richmond in January 2010. Patricia Calloway answered the door. She was pleasant and a little confused, and went to get her husband while they waited in a living room with carefully chosen furniture and family photographs on the fireplace, mantle in matching frames. Daniel Calloway came into the room, and Hess watched his face in those first seconds, registering the badge, then their faces, then making a quick practice calculation, and then arranging an expression appropriate for an older man, cooperating helpfully with an inquiry he was not required to help with at all. He sat down. He offered coffee. He was told this was about the 1971 case. He said he understood. What Daniel Calloway said over the next hour was precise and carefully unrevealing, in ways that Hess recognized as the product of a man who had thought, at some point over the preceding decades, about what he would say if someone came. He said he had loved Eleanor. He said he had been deeply affected by her disappearance. He said he had cooperated fully with the original investigation and had nothing further to add. He said he was glad a letter had been found because at least now Eleanor's family could have some peace. Hess asked him directly, had Eleanor ever expressed unhappiness during the courtship? Daniel said the marriage had lasted one night and that it was difficult to express unhappiness in so short a time. The answer was technically accurate and deliberately evasive. Hess noted it in his report with careful language. The truth came not from one source but from 5. What Hess would learn over the following 3 months came from 4 additional people. 2 former colleagues of Daniel's in Valaton, a woman who had been Margaret Marsh's neighbor for 15 years, and an elderly cousin of Eleanor's named Violet, who lived in a care home in Fredericksburg. Violet was 81 years old, and she had decided she was too old to keep protecting people who did not deserve to be protected. What these conversations revealed was this. Daniel Calloway had known, or strongly suspected, that Eleanor was unhappy, not because she had told him directly, because of what she had stopped doing, because of a notebook he had found once and asked about, which had then disappeared, because of a conversation he had partly overheard between Eleanor and Ruth Ann at the pharmacy, which had ended abruptly when Eleanor heard his footsteps, because of the way she moved through their engagement, cooperatively, graciously, without any real spontaneity. He had known she was holding back. He had not addressed it because addressing it would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledgement would have meant giving her the opportunity to say something he did not want to hear in a social setting where an engaged woman expressing doubt was a significant and consequential event. He managed the situation by not creating space for it to become a situation. He had believed, or told himself he believed, that marriage itself would solve what he saw as Eleanor's hesitation. That once they were married, she would settle into it. That the shape of the life he was offering would feel real to her once she was inside it, rather than looking at it from the outside. This was not a planned scheme. It was not entirely conscious, but it was a form of pressure, quiet and steady and dressed in the language of patience and love. And it had worked right up until the moment it stopped working, which was the moment Eleanor Marsh folded her wedding dress over a chair in a room at the Hargrove Inn and walked out a door and did not come back. Violet, Eleanor's cousin, said this about Daniel Calloway from her chair in the sunroom of the Fredericksburg care home. He was the kind of man who decides how things are going to go and then waits for everyone else to agree. Most people do eventually. Eleanor did not. I always thought that was the most Eleanor thing she ever did. The law had limits here, and that was the most uncomfortable truth of all. The investigation, formally reopened in early 2010, produced no criminal charges against anyone. There was no crime in the technical sense. A woman had left a marriage on the night it began. This was not against the law in 1971 and was not against the law in 2010. Daniel Calloway had withheld nothing from the original investigators, except his private understanding of his wife's state of mind, information the investigators had not known to ask for, and which he perhaps had not been fully honest with himself about either. What he had done fell into a category of human failure that the law does not generally address. Thomas Creel had kept the knowledge of a phone call that might have ended the search earlier and saved Eleanor's family years of uncertainty. This was also not against the law, though it produced the most morally complicated question in the whole case. It required weighing Eleanor's privacy, her right to have left without being found, against her family's pain. There was no place on that scale that did not cost something. The investigation produced not a location, but a truth. Not Eleanor's physical presence, but the reality of who she was. The reality of a woman who had looked clearly at her own life, found it was not what she wanted, and done something about it at great personal cost. She had walked away from her family, her home, and her name. In an era when women who walked away from marriages were not generally understood as exercising a right, but as committing a kind of social mistake. She had walked away. She had built something else somewhere else, under whatever name she chose. In a life that belonged to no case, file and no newspaper archive and no shoebox in a storage unit, the letter she had, written and hidden under the desk blotter in the corner, room of the Hargrove Inn, was always meant to be found. Not immediately. She had not left it somewhere obvious. She had hidden it in a place where it might travel forward in time, to be discovered eventually, by someone eventually, when the people whose feelings it might hurt most were either gone or far enough from the original moment to survive it. Margaret Marsh had passed away in 1994. Robert Marsh had passed away in 1989. They had never known. Ruth Ann Poole, 81 years old in 2010, and was the one who wept when Deputy Hess came to tell her what had been found. She wept for a long time. When she stopped, she said, "I knew she did not want to go. I should have said something." And Hess, who was 27 and learning the particular texture of cold cases, said that it was possible saying something might not have changed the outcome. That Eleanor's decision had been made in a place where other people's words might not have reached anyway. He believed this. He was also not entirely sure of it. Neither, he could tell, was Ruth Ann. In March 2010, the Sheriff's Department issued a press release describing the Calloway case as substantially resolved, a phrase chosen for its careful vagueness. The release stated that newly discovered evidence, including a personal letter written by Eleanor Marsh on the night of her disappearance, showed she had left voluntarily and was not believed to be the victim of any crime. The case remained technically open because Eleanor had never been formally found, and the law requires either a living confirmation or a death certificate before a missing person case can be closed. Eleanor had provided neither. The press release received moderate attention, mostly in local Virginia newspapers and in the online communities that follow cold case stories. The story was picked up briefly by a national true crime program and then faded, as most stories do when the next story arrived. The aftermath was quieter than the mystery, but heavier in its own way. Thomas Creel gave a brief public statement through a lawyer, acknowledging that he had received a phone call from Eleanor on the morning of September 6, 1971, and had not disclosed it. He said he had made the decision he believed Eleanor would have wanted, and he was sorry for the pain it had caused her family, and he understood if people saw his choice differently than he did. The responses were mixed, which is what happens when a moral question does not resolve into a clean verdict. Daniel Calloway did not respond publicly to the findings. He remained in Richmond. His wife Patricia gave a brief statement through the same lawyer, expressing relief that the case had been clarified and asking for privacy. There were people who felt Daniel Calloway should have been held accountable for something. There were people who argued that what he had done fell entirely within the range of ordinary human failure, and that accountability requires a wrong more clearly defined than the one he had committed. Both positions were held by reasonable people. The law, which requires very specific things, took no position. Violet, Eleanor's cousin, passed away in 2013, 3 years after giving her statement. She was buried in Fredericksburg with a small gathering of people who had mostly known her only in her final years. In her personal belongings, the care home staff found a single photograph they could not place. A woman in her 30s or 40s, dark honey hair beginning to go silver at the temples, smiling at something outside the frame of the picture. On the back, in Violet's handwriting, E. 1988. She writes sometimes no one knew where the photograph had come from. No one knew what name Eleanor Marsh was using in 1988, or where she was, or whether she was still living. The photograph was given to the Sheriff's Department, photographed, entered into the case file, and returned to Violet's estate. What happened to it after that is not documented. Some truths take 38 years to rise to the surface. They sit in shoeboxes and storage units and the kept silences of people who made decisions they were never fully certain were right. And they wait, with the patience of things that have nowhere else to be. The world does not rush truths toward us. It does not require them to arrive on a schedule that suits the living. Eleanor Marsh made her choice in a small room in a small town, in the middle of a night that everyone around her believed was the beginning of her life as it was meant to be. She chose differently. She wrote it down on 4 pages of cream-colored paper in her careful, unhurried hand. She hid those pages somewhere they would wait. She walked out through a door that appeared to be locked from the inside, but which no one had thought to check from that side. and down a staircase in a building where the owner was asleep. She walked out into the Virginia night and disappeared into the life she was going to build. We do not know what that life was. We have the photograph, a woman smiling at something outside the frame, her hair going silver 17 years after she left. We have the 4 pages of her letter. We have Thomas Creel's account of a phone call from a payphone in Harrisonburg. We have Violet's notation. She writes sometimes. What we do not have is Eleanor herself, her own account of the decades, her experience of having made the choice and then actually lived with it. The solitude, the freedom, the cost of both, the way a person puts herself back together after walking away from everything that has ever been used to define her. Here is what the evidence tells us. She was alive in 1988, 17 years after the wedding night. She was somewhere. She was smiling at something. She was writing sometimes to a cousin who kept her secret and her photograph and said nothing until she was old enough, and her silence had outlived most of the people it was protecting. Ruth Ann Poole, in her final interview, said she had thought for many years about that afternoon in the pharmacy, the one where Eleanor had said she sometimes thought about leaving. She wished she had responded differently. She wished she had said, "Then go," not because Eleanor needed her permission, but because she wanted Eleanor to have known that there was at least one person who would have said it, who would have offered that kind of love, the kind that lets go rather than holds on. The case file of Eleanor Agnes Calloway remains open in Vailton County, Virginia. It will stay open until Eleanor provides a living confirmation, which seems unlikely at this point, or until a death certificate is filed, which no one has yet had reason to file. The file sits in its cabinet in the county records office. It is growing no heavier. It is going nowhere. The woman it describes is somewhere and was somewhere at minimum. In 1988, living under a name that belongs to her alone, in a life that no official document has yet found a way to reach. There is a kind of justice in that, and a kind of sadness, and a kind of complicated respect for a woman who understood, at 24 years old in 1971, in a small Virginia town that was not built for women who walked away, that she had the right to choose her own path. She exercised that right with remarkable precision. She has not been found. Whether she ever wanted to be found is a question no one left alive can answer. Silence is not the same as absence, and absence is not the same as loss, though the people left behind tend to treat it that way. The truth, when it finally surfaces, is rarely exactly what anyone was waiting for. It is usually smaller, and larger, and more human, and harder to hold on to than the mystery that came before it. Eleanor Marsh folded her wedding dress over the back of a chair. She placed her shoes side by side beneath it. She wrote 4 pages in her careful hand and hid them somewhere they would wait. Then she walked through a door and into a life that belonged finally and completely to her. Some truths take decades to surface. This one took 38 years. A storage unit in Charlottesville and a daughter who decided to finally sort through her father's boxes before winter fully settled in. That is the way of buried things. They wait, they are patient. They do not need our acknowledgement to remain true.